Hi, I'm Jonathan with Franklinton CycleWorks. In this lesson, I'm going to talk to you about converting your road bike into a fixed gear. Now, the first thing you want to pay attention to is frame selection. Most older road bikes from the 70s or 80s are going to be pretty good candidates, but here's the clue. You want to look at the dropouts. You're going to need what are called horizontal dropouts. Getting the proper chain tension that you need for a fixed gear is really difficult with vertical dropouts. So you're going to want these horizontal ones. Now, after you've selected your frame, you're basically going to want to strip it down. Mostly what you're going to want to do is take off the rear derailleur and the front derailleur, all the shifting elements. With a fixed gear, you don't need to shift. So get rid of all that stuff. It's just extra weight. The next thing you're going to want to do is probably buy a new rear wheel. There are ways of converting the old road bike wheels into fixes, but they're not very safe. I recommend buying a track wheel. So after you've gotten your rear wheel, you just slip it into the dropouts like you would any other wheel. The spacing might be a little bit different since the bike wasn't originally designed for the track hub. Generally, it's not going to be too big of a deal, but you might have to get spacers to get the wheel in there straight. This is going to become important when we try and get the chain line straight. Now, the next thing you're going to want to pay attention to is gear ratio. Gear ratio is basically going to be the difference between the chain ring up front and the cog in the rear. 3:1 is a fairly stiff gear ratio, but if you're on a flat surface, it's pretty good. But the key element is going to be the type of environment you're riding in and the type of riding you plan to do. So next, we're going to put our crank back on. Alright, so once we have our crank arm back on with our chain rings in place, it's now time to install the chain. You can buy single speed chains. Now, the most important thing to note about this is chain line. You want your chain to be nice and straight between your track cog and your chain ring up front. If your chain line is off, it increases the chances of the chain actually slipping off, which is quite dangerous with a fixed gear bike. Now, generally in the conversion process, the inner chain ring on your old crank set is going to produce the straightest line to the chain. You may be tempted to use the larger chain ring, either just for aesthetic purposes or for that gear ratio that you desire, but the inner chain ring is what's going to provide the straight line. You want to get a good idea of the length of the chain just by pulling it tight. Once you've resized and attached your chain, to check the chain line, you can look at the chain down from the rear of the bike. Now again, you just want to make sure that it's nice and straight. A chain at an angle between the track cog and the chain ring will cause problems. Make sure it's straight. The next thing we want to do is get chain tension correct. We're basically going to pull the rear, or the rear wheel backwards. That's why we want to have the horizontal dropouts. Pull the rear wheel backwards. You just loosen the lug nut bolts, pull the wheel into place, and then finger tighten the lug nut bolts back into place so that the wheel is held in place. You don't want it too tight, but you want it fairly tight. You don't want the chain bouncing off when you go over bumps, but at the same time you want a little bit of slack. Then slowly tighten the wheel back into place. So once you've got the proper chain tension, you just want to check it. Give your crank a couple rotations. Make sure that everything's working properly. So that's the basics of converting your old road bike into a fixed gear. After you've got the wheel in place, the chain tension correct, the rest of it is just aesthetics. Putting the front wheel back on, choosing your seat, and all that. I'm Jonathan with Franklinton CycleWorks, and that's how you convert your road bike into a fixed gear.